Good evening and welcome to another fun-filled, exciting presentation on building interactive goodness with Flash. This session is going to be focused on detecting collisions between on-screen objects, which is useful if you have any type of shooter game, of course, but it's also useful if you're trying to work on, say, a platform-style game where you have to be aware of when your character or player is engaged with the ground or platform, or when they are not, such as when they're jumping or flying through the air, when they're colliding with obstacles, and then handling those types of collisions. So we're going to start out first and just have a basic interactive, which will have two objects on screen and a text field that feeds us information as to whether the objects are indeed touching or not touching. Currently it is set up so that the objects are instantiated dynamically from the library and they've been given X and Y positions and added to the screen with our setup function running that now should reveal then the two boxes and the text indicating that they are not touching. So currently nothing is draggable, nothing's moving, so of course they are not touching, but there is no logic occurring yet to tell us that. Now the only thing that bears further explanation is my movie clip text field, which is a movie clip that then contains a text field which has the instance name of touching. So when you see that referenced in the code a little bit later, you will remember that the instance name for the text field, which is the dynamic text field, not static or input, but is dynamic, and its name is touching. So knowing that the objects will now show up on screen, we are ready to start adding a little bit of functionality to the whole project. The first part that I'm going to add in is the capacity to make the red box draggable. So I first need to create a function, start dragging, and it is going to be related to a mouse event because I will press down on an object to start dragging. So mouse event does not return anything, and then I can just simply say box rad dot start drag, and we can see the code hinting is giving me some basic information, and one is lock center, so it takes the object and locks its registration point to the mouse pointer. If I don't put a value in, so box rad dot start drag parenthesis close parenthesis. So start drag is simply the method or the action we want to have happen. So at this point, if I add an event listener for the mouse event, then when I press down on this, it's going to then start dragging that object. So we can do it by saying box rad dot add event listener to mouse event, and now the event we're looking for is going to be, as you can see, we have our different options. Before we've used click often. We did find that mouse down worked better for greater accuracy in a click game, so I use that, and then we'll reference the start dragging function that we've created here. Take a look at it, we can see that I can start dragging, but once I start, it doesn't stop. So the next course of operation is going to be adding in a stop drag. It's going to be fairly similar, so I'm going to use copy paste, and instead of mouse down, I can just delete that, retype the period, and now I can choose mouse up. Advantage of the code completion is I know I've typed it correctly. If I type it manually, I don't know if I'm necessarily getting the correct language to go with it. Now I can copy that, paste it, and notice they both say start dragging. I need to make one say stop. Common problem of doing copy pasting is you'll forget that and then wonder why it's not working when they're both referencing the same function. Now, a little difference is stop drag is just simply stop drag. There is no parameter of what object should be told to stop dragging, because once we say stop drag, anything that is being dragged stops being draggable. So it makes it fairly straightforward. We don't have to say box red dot stop drag. We can just say stop drag. Now I click, it stops. Press down, drag, let go, it stops. Now, because I didn't say log center, you can see it drags from the point that I click on. If I did indeed want my draggable object to be tied to the center, we could say true. Now at this point, if I click, or not tied center, it ties it to the registration point, which, because it is in that exact top left corner, it's making it really hard for it to register that I have stopped dragging on it. So if I run it again, we'll see how the box jumped to my mouse, and because it's right at that point, I can't get it to register the mouse up, because when I let go of up, my mouse pointer is actually kind of what appears to be about 1 pixel off. So if I was going to use that as part of my code, I would want to, instead of using start drag with true, I would want to, if I did do that, I would need to adjust the registration point inside my object, so the registration point is not, as we can see, at the top left corner, but I would want that registration point to be in the middle of my graphic. That would allow it to work a little bit better. So at this point, it's draggable. I let go of the mouse, it stops dragging. So I'm off to a good start. The next thing that I want to have happen is I want to update the text inside my text field so that it's going to indicate whether the red box is touching the green box or not. So with that, we need to start checking for something every frame, and when we get a positive result on that, then I need to update that text. So at this point, I'm going to add an event listener. Now I want to do the enter frame. As you can see, I'm not getting decent code completion because I don't have the function created yet. So function, this will be a loop using the same structure conventions we've used in the past. It ties to an event, the enter frame event. And now when I type that period, I get the code completion that I'm looking for. So when you're trying to use code completion, you need to have your imports in place so that when you want it to complete the items, it knows what's there. When you're creating your functions or creating variables, that's a good way to coax Flash into creating the imports, and once it has those, you get much better code completion. So now I'll choose enter frame here in my loop. And now what we want to do in plain language is say if box red is touching or intersecting or colliding with box green, change the text inside my touch text field touching dot text property to something else. Currently it is set to not touching. So that was a really long, ugly sentence, but once we see it in action, it's going to make a little bit more sense. What I can do is just simply say if, and I'm going to present 3 separate ways to go about doing this. The easiest way is going to utilize a built-in feature of Flash, which allows for very easy and rapid hit detection. And then we will show some more kind of purely code-based that will allow it to work when you don't have access to that type of structure, such as a display list and movie clips and built-in methods and properties and things like that. If box red dot hit test object, so this is a property of display objects. Movie clips are display objects, therefore we can use this method. And then we specify what we're looking to see if it's hitting. So if that's true, then at this point I want to update my text. So I can say if box red hit test object box green is true, that's what that line number 30 in the code says, then so we have the movie clip, the text field, and now we specify its text property, and we want it to be equal to something, touching. So I have a straight conditional that checks when this situation is true, it's going to change the value. If I run my movie, not true, not true, not true, not true, touching. Now the problem is when I move back out, it's not resetting itself. This requires me to introduce the next level of conditional, which is else. When I have an else statement, it's what I want it to be when the previous line is not true. So I'll just put this in here and say not touching. So that replicates the text that's currently inside the text field, not touching, but then when it is true, it's going to make that happen. I can run this and see touching, not touching, touching, not touching. Now, one thing about this hit test object and the other methods we're going to look at, you will find that they work best with rectangular objects or square or tile-like objects. It does not work well when you have an irregular shaped object or a round object or a triangular object where you don't have a box that you can surround it with. In the interest of simplicity, that box method of collision detection is what we're going to work with right now. As you become more advanced in your coding expertise, you will find that there are a whole host of other methods that you can explore that allow you to do different types of collision detection, even so far as down to the exact pixel. But that comes with a price, because when you ask it to be that much more particular or exacting with its collision detection, it will slow down performance. So there's always going to be a trade-off. If you can do rectangular or tile-based collision, that is going to be one of the fastest methods, regardless of how you perform the calculation, for determining whether a collision has occurred. An additional method for determining whether two objects are touching utilizes a portion of the object's width and height. It also requires access to a math function within ActionScript, which is a common math function we can find in virtually all programming languages, and that's being able to determine the absolute value of a number. So if I have a number like 5, the absolute value of 5 is actually equal to the absolute value of minus 5, because absolute value means we throw away any minus signs and we just look at the number itself. What is the number? We don't care whether it's positive or negative. That's the basic construct. So 5 is equal to minus 5. Minus 1 is equal to 1. It's just a matter of getting rid of that negative sign and just treating it as its whole value. Now, as part of doing this, I'm going to break things into multiple lines. And absolute value in math is ABS. So I do ABS. I'll put in a parenthesis. And now at this point, we can see that I'm going to put in an additional parenthesis here and hit return, trying to balance out my parentheses so that I have those two lining up. I'll have these two, because otherwise my screen isn't going to be long enough to show the value in its entirety. So I'm going to take the absolute value of box.red, it's x, and I'm going to add to it box.red dot width, but only half of its width. Now I'm going to take the red box and half its width. The red box is x position and half its width, and I'm going to subtract from that the green box is x position plus half its width. So we're going to need a few extra parentheses to make sense out of this. So with that, we'll put this in parentheses, then we'll subtract box green dot x plus box green dot width divided by 2. So I'm taking the absolute value, so then that will give me the difference between the x position plus half the width of one object, subtracting the other. And the reason I subtract is to find out, how far apart are they, and the absolute value gives me an empirical value without concern whether one object is to the left or to the right. Otherwise, I could do a check and say, well, if this object's to the left, subtract this one from this, and if this object, the other object is further left, then subtract that object from the other. That's a whole bunch of needless conditionals. Using math.absolute just gives me the value that I need. So as you can see, I have these extra parentheses in there, hopefully so that we can fit things on lines a little bit cleaner. Extra line returns do not cause problems with Flash. So I want this value, and I want to know whether this value is less than the sum of half of the width of each object, because if it is, that would indicate that these two objects are indeed overlapping, because if the difference between the two objects is and half their widths is going to be greater than the half width of each one, then at that point we know that they are indeed overlapping. So now at this point on this next line, box red dot width divided by 2 plus, instead of a subtraction, it's a plus, which is why I don't need to use an additional math absolute calculation. Box green dot width divided by 2. And knowing that, so now this gives me a conditional of whether it's going. I'm going to see if I can coax this up onto the same line here. We'll put this down a little bit just to buy ourselves a little bit of space. So the absolute value of the x plus the width minus the x plus the width, half widths, is that less than half the widths of the two objects added together? If so, that would indicate the two objects are overlapping on their x value. So if I run this, I can see that touching, not touching, not touching. And this works whether the objects are the same size, different size, anything. But it does require them to have that same left registration point. Otherwise, it gets wonky and doesn't work. But if you notice, it said they're touching when indeed they're not. We only checked for the x. So in this case, they're touching. But here, they're touching, but the y values aren't. So we're going to have to add in some y value magic into this. And it's going to be the same, but instead of using x's, we'll use y's. Instead of using widths, we'll use height. two recommended ways to go about doing this. One is I could put a conditional within a conditional. So I first check the x's. If that indicates they're not overlapping, we don't need to do any further checks. The other is I could use an ampersand and say I want both the x's have to overlap and the y's have to overlap, but that means it will perform the full calculation x and y every time. For what we're going to be doing, that is not going to be a performance impediment, so I think we can go ahead and roll with it. So the way to add to it is to use a double ampersand. That says, and I want a following condition to be met as well. And I'm going to, in the interest of keeping sanity while typing, hopefully pull it off without any typos, though I use copy-paste. X's become y's, width will become a height. And if all goes well, so height, 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 y, y. So we say if their x's and their y's are overlapping, we want it to indicate accordingly, and not touching, touching, not touching, touching. So it seems to be working, and it's fairly accurate. So that would be a good way to go about doing it. It does require access to a math object to perform that calculation, but it is not using a built-in method such as hitTestObject, which is something you would only see either in Flash or in a library that uses Flashlight capabilities such as Easel.js, which is made by Grant Skinner, amazing library that allows you to write JavaScript that is extremely similar to Flash. They've actually taken Easel.js and incorporated it into the next version of ActionScript, so into CS6, so that Flash is having the ability to export as JavaScript. So that now gives us a second method to do this. A third method that we'll look at next does not require a math object, does not require hitTestObject or a built-in method. It's purely just going to be based on x and y coordinates. Again, it will only work on the rectangular properties of an object. Objects that are not rectangular, it will not function with, and you would need to use a different way to calculate intersections. The next method is one that I stumbled across fairly recently, and it actually was in a JavaScript HTML5 reference, and I thought it was pretty interesting the way I went about it. It's more similar to the half-width method. Again, none of these are as easy as the built-in method of hitTestObject, which is a one-liner, boom, done. But if you're looking for something that's going to be versatile and work in more languages so you don't depend on a built-in function or feature, but you want to do it old school, then this would be the way to go. It requires registration in the top left corner. Again, it works for, we're testing the rectangular boundaries of the object, and then it gives decent outlay with it. So with that, it looks like box red.x plus box red.width, and then we're going to check if that is greater than the box green dot x. So what this is doing is it's determining if the x of the red box plus its width is now a greater number, indicating that the object is, that value is going to be to the left of the x of the second object on screen. And then with that, we're going to do a similar comparison, say box green dot x plus box green dot width is greater than box red dot x. So it's very similar in terms of we're taking the red box and finding out is the x plus the width more than the x of green and the green. And we can test this before we add in more because it says touching. So it's now telling us. So is the x of the object, top left corner, plus its width, which is now this number, is that greater than the x of the second object. Cross it over and boom, it is. So even if I'd only put in the one line of information, that first one would have worked, but we need both to get it fully functional for all situations. And now it's a matter of doing it with y's, so I will copy paste, change my x's to y's and my widths to height. And then we don't need the final double ampersand because this one and this one and this one and this one. So this says we're taking care of all possibilities of x orientation, all possibilities of y orientation, and once that's done, not touching, touching, not touching, touching, la-di-da. So there you have it, 3 separate ways of determining whether objects are colliding or overlapping with each other on screen. If you can get away with using hit test object, that's the easiest from a code standpoint. Otherwise, I think the final method presented is a little bit cleaner than the half-width method, which gets a little bit tricky of, are you tracking x and y? Is it a plus? Is it a minus? Is it math and absolute? That's the method I've been using for quite some time, for the last number of years, more so than hit test object for some performance reasons, but I'm inclined to go with this final method because it is just a little bit cleaner to look at, and it certainly lends itself to easier code to read. Good luck and have fun.